Hey, I'm Patrick, and if you were looking to make some power with your Milwaukee 8 powered Harley Davidson, then you are in the right place. We're gonna walk you through how to build a 150 horsepower Harley Davidson right in your own garage. And not only are we gonna walk you through our build, we've actually made installation videos for each step of the process. So you may be interested in doing this exact same build. You may be interested in just doing parts of it to your motorcycle, and we've made very detailed installation videos to walk you through that. For us, we started with a bone stock motored Milwaukee 8 Harley Davidson in the form of a 2019 Fat Bob. And we knew we were gonna do some modifications to the engine, so we did do a few other things to the bike to kind of help us out and control that power on the road. We added Legends cartridge kit to the front end and a Legends monocoil shock to the back, along with some performance machine and brakes to help us stop all this newfound horsepower. If you're looking to do those, we actually have installation videos for those parts as well. We needed a baseline. So we went to the dyno with our stock motored Harley Davidson, and we got a rather paltry 77 horsepower. So we knew we had our work cut out for us on this build. We brought our 77 horsepower bike back into the shop, and we started with the crankshaft. But to get to that, we had to disassemble, obviously, the entire engine to start building it back. We started with a really good platform in S&S Cycle's 131 kit. That's 131 cubic inches, and it's the crankshaft, pistons, and cylinders by adding more to the stroke and more to the bore, getting that big volume of 131 inches. But it also gives us a very, very strong bottom end of our motorcycle, because those Harley bottom ends are known to shift a little bit, especially under high horsepower. We put in our S&S Cycle crankshaft, got those cases bolted back together, put it back in the bike to start building our top end. From there, we used those S&S Cycle pistons and cylinders, and we stayed with the stock compression. We didn't go any kind of crazy compression with this bike. We stayed around that 11:1 number because we want this bike to run on pump gas. There's no real funny business here. We didn't go with crazy fuel. The dyno numbers you're gonna see at the end of this video were done on straight 91 octane pump gas. I knew we wanted a good cylinder head on this bike. And cylinder heads are something that you can get very, very exotic on and make a lot of power with. We weren't looking to break the bank. We actually went with an off-the-shelf Screamin Eagle cylinder head. Just a straight up ported Screamin Eagle cylinder head you can buy at the local dealer. But we did do some upgrades. We had to put better valve springs in there for the cam we were using. The valve spring rating on those Screamin Eagle cylinder heads wasn't quite what we wanted. So we swapped those out for some S&S Cycle valve springs to go with our big cam that we'd be putting in later on. From there, we put in some roller rockers. The S&S roller rocker is not only a much better performing as far as like friction and moving nice and smooth in the engine, it's a better oiling setup too on that rocker arm. We wanted to make sure that was good and strong, so we put in the S&S Cycle rocker arm shafts. That is a known failure on high horsepower Milwaukee 8s, so we upgraded that rocker arm shaft, and not only did we do that, we also added some Feuling rocker arm studs in there as well. It's a good thing if you're gonna be in there to upgrade those parts, keep them as strong as possible. After we had that cylinder head all buttoned up, we moved on to the camshaft. And for this job, we used a really big cam. We used an S&S 590 lift cam. We did that for a couple of reasons. And a lot of people are kind of afraid to use these big lift cams, but if you're set up for it, you can use them and it makes a good street cam. Now, just for instance, this bike ends up making a boatload of torque, but it makes over 100 foot-pounds of torque at just 3,000 RPM. So the thing comes in pretty early. We used a gear drive cam setup, and the reason I went with gear drive, it's the hot rod way to go, and it does free up a few extra ponies, but with that S&S Cycle bottom end, that crankshaft, we knew our run out was going to be very, very good, less than a half a thou. We also knew we could count on those flywheels not to shift like some of the stock ones will. If you do use a stock bottom end, I recommend maybe going with a chain drive setup. But for us, we used that gear drive setup. And of course, we paired that with the S&S Cycle oil pump and cam plate to get us better oil pressure, more oil volume flowing through there, and really keep that engine nice and safe. Moving on up, we went with some Feuling short stroke lifters and S&S Cycle tappet cups. If you're gonna be in there and replace those lifters, definitely use those little tappet cups. It's a cheap upgrade and very, very worth it. As far as push rods are concerned, we use S&S Quickie style push rods. One of the reasons I did that, if we ever want to pull these in and out, swap cams, we don't have to take our complete rocker assembly off the top. Those Quickie push rods give us the option of getting in and out of there without creating any more work for ourselves. Now, after our motor was built, we needed to fuel this thing, and that's one of the weak spots in the Milwaukee 8 engine if you really want to build some horsepower. And again, we used off-the-shelf parts. There's plenty of options out there as far as throttle bodies, getting them ported, doing some really big ones. We went with an off-the-shelf setup, again, from Harley Davidson. We just used a Screamin Eagle 64mm throttle body and an aluminum manifold. That will give us options down the road. We could have that manifold ported, but this is a straight bolt-on, no funny stuff there, off-the-shelf parts once again. If you're going to make a bunch of horsepower, another choke point in the fueling of a Milwaukee 8 is the injector. We went with a 6.1 fueling injector, and what that means is it moves 6.1 grams a second as far as fuel through the engine. Conversely, you're looking at about 4.1 on a stock injector, so much more efficient fueling system on our build. After that, we had a couple other things to tackle. What exhaust are we going to use? What intake are we going to use? And maybe more importantly, what tuner are we going to use? So we put a Bassani Road Rage 2-in-1 on there. When you're picking these pipes, you really need to look for something that kind of steps up. And that Bassani does that. It has a nice step in it, has nice long primaries. And we wanted a 2-in-1 because it's going to be a street-ridden bike. We wanted to get our power down low, but the Bassani also is able to make that power up high. It doesn't choke us off. We went with the S&S Cycle Stealth intake. That gives you a lot of options as far as finishes and things like that, how you want to finish it out. And it's a good performing intake. No problem supporting all of our horsepower. Now, the tuner, we went with a Thundermax, and we'll touch on this when we get to our final dyno number. The Thundermax gives you the ability to tune wideband and closed loop in your own garage. If you want more information on wideband and closed loop, we have videos that break that down, but it's kind of the ultimate way to tune on your own. But we weren't done there. We knew with all this newfound horsepower, we had to get it to the ground, so we really needed to address our entire driveline. We started with another weak point in the Milwaukee 8 is that comp sprocket up front. Start building big horsepower, you will break those. So we went to a solid comp sprocket from Evolution Industries up in the front of our drivetrain, and we put a Recluse torque drive in as our clutch. Now, I've heard of guys using stock clutches with heavy springs, things like that to hold the horsepower. The nice thing about the torque drive is it will hold all this horsepower and it gives you a stock clutch feel. You're not gonna have problems pulling in the clutch when you're in town with a huge spring because you get to keep all of that stock feel and still be able to hold all the horsepower. And finally, we converted this thing to a chain. I didn't want to risk snapping belts off left and right. Also gives us a chance if we ever want to adjust our gearing, we can. We used a Performance Machine chain drive kit to get our power ultimately to the ground of this beast. After that was done, we needed to heat cycle this thing, get some miles on it, and get it back to the dyno. You don't need a dyno if you really want to do this in your garage. You can tune with that Thundermax. It gives you the ability to get those correct air fuels just by riding the bike and getting where you're going. Now, I'd recommend definitely breaking these style engines in. Put some time on them, varied RPMs back and forth, heat cycle, do your oil changes to break it in, and you have a great running engine like we do. But if you do go to a dyno to see where you end up, that's always a very gratifying feeling. Go to somebody you trust, go to somebody that knows what they're doing. We went to Jason at Speeds. Jason was a great choice for us, and we ended up with a whopping 148 horsepower and let's call it 148 foot-pounds of torque out of our machine. And this was on an 85-degree day with about 45% humidity at 3,500 feet elevation. Why that's important is all those numbers affect the dyno number at the end. People get wrapped up in dyno numbers, but just remember, the dyno is a tool. That number can vary on where you're at in the country, as far as your elevation. If you're down closer to sea level, that number is gonna be bigger. If there's less humidity, if it's cooler air, that's gonna affect that number. Our number was also SAE. For you guys out there that follow horsepower numbers and are really into that, that's the correction factor that's used, and that's kind of the standard correction factor is that SAE number. There are other factors, like if somebody does like just what's called the STD number, the same dyno pull will read higher, but the SAE is kind of the standard, and that's the one you want to make horsepower on. I didn't get too wrapped up in our dyno number. I'm very happy with what our bike made. It may make more in the future once the motor gets loosened up, but 150 horsepower, 150 foot-pound torque, street Harley on pump gas is very, very exciting to ride. This bike will grease the tire in second gear, no problem, just rolling down the road. It's all we can handle to ride. I couldn't be happier with this build. Super stoked on how it turned out. Now, if you have any questions about any of the parts you've seen us use in this video, you can always click on the info tab on your desktop and mobile device. That'll take you to the product detail pages where you can read other specifications and other riders' reviews about these parts. If you still have questions, feel free to reach out to our customer service team. They would love to talk to you about your motorcycle, your build, what works best for your budget and your riding style. As always, I'm Patrick. Thank you for watching. Go work on those motorcycles.